Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the Heritage Room and the John James Reading Series. The John James Reading Series is a monthly reading series featuring works and writings by Nebraska authors. Our reader tonight is John Stevens Berry. Mr. Berry is a well-known Lincoln attorney and is a fellow of the American Board of Criminal Lawyers. He did his undergraduate work at Stanford University, where he studied under Wallace Stigner. He has written a book of poems called Darkness of Snow. Several of the poems in this book have received awards from the Academy of American Poets. His latest book, Those Gallant Men on Trial in Vietnam, has been widely reviewed and is about his experiences as Chief Defense Counsel for soldiers in Vietnam. Mr. Berry has also written widely on Sherlock Holmes, and these writings have been published in America, England, and Japan. Mr. Berry.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. I am going to divide my reading a little bit tonight. I have a few things I want to read, some poems from my book, some prose from my book, and one published but uncollected article. I'm not going to take the whole evening. I am going to give some time to my sister Glenna, and I will introduce her later. Glenna and I both grew up in Ottawa, Iowa. I went to college in California and ended up in Lincoln. She went to college in Lincoln and ended up in California. I am glad she's here. She's a great poet, and I will introduce her more fully later. My poems are a little difficult for a number of reasons. First of all, I do not agree with the commonly held notion that it is not possible to express contemporary thoughts in contemporary language and still use meter and rhyme. The strictures of meter and rhyme didn't bother William Shakespeare, and I very modestly might add, they don't bother me. I write that way. Years ago, I had the opportunity of meeting Robert Frost, and he said I would no more write in free verse than I would play tennis with a net down. And I'm the sole surviving sonneteer in America, and rapidly becoming extinct. At least I don't write sonnets anymore. I'm going to read a little first from my book of poems. My book of poems is a demanding and difficult book for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that I do write in meter and rhyme. Another reason is that I presuppose that my reader has done a lot of reading, knows a little bit about mythology, a little bit about history. And so the poems are kind of difficult, but I'm going to cheat a little and tell you some of the things that I assume that maybe you might want to have read. The name of my book is Darkness of Snow. I'm going to read the title poem first with a word of explanation. In the old days, I used to hunt. That was before Vietnam, and that was in the days when I thought it was kind of fun to shoot at things that couldn't shoot back. I don't feel that way anymore, so I don't hunt anymore. But in those days, I did, and there was one thing I noticed and enjoyed, maybe, or was a little terrified by. It's something the Romantic poets have dealt with. The Romantic poets like to talk about the fact that you can kind of blend, if you would allow me to use that expression, blend into nature. They discuss this in glowing and rapturous terms. I find the notion terrifying. And I find that as you become part of your environment, you are saved, if I may use the word saved, insofar as you keep a sense of your own identity. That is the final point, to me at least, of sanity. So this is my title poem. It is a sonnet, written in iambic pentameter, 14 lines, rhymes, the whole works. John Donne did it, Shakespeare did it, nobody ran them out of town, so I'm going to do it. I don't need these glasses really, but I understand they make me look distinguished. Darkness of snow. Darkness of snow, cold moon on rifle stock, heavy in lethal silence, bright with sleet, trees shimmer, and the stirring birds repeat the movement of the brittle leaves, the shock of slow wind edging lifelessness to me, quickens my stare into the snow that stills dark forms that may be dear on darker hills, increases till I can no longer see. My knowledge ends with visibility. Snow fades on flesh, crystal tenacity, lost against heat and blindness when I turn. It is to blindness. Other snowflakes burn. New loss against me. I remain the same. In chill monotony of change, a name. That was a sonnet, and I have another one, which is a prayer. I see my daughter Laura. Some of you know her as a champion bicyclist. I'm glad she's here. This poem was written to her before she was born. It was called Prayer for My Child Not Yet Born. It was written in a sonnet form, and I not only was trying to use modern language and modern ideas within the structure of the sonnet, but I was trying to do something else. I was trying to use both the images of Nebraska and Vietnam and the nursery all in the same poem. I don't know how you're going to feel about this poem, but I think I succeeded. This is a good poem. I got to tell you this. If anybody ever asks you if a great poem was written in this century, or you just tell them, yeah, there has one, a great sonnet. A great sonnet was written, and iambic pentameter, 14 lines that works, and you got to hear it read by a very modest man. And I'll do my best, but this is a good poem. This is my best poem. See, people won't tell you that. They'll say, well, I'm going to read you 18 poems and pick one. This is my best poem. I wrote it for Laura, and she's here. Prayer for my child, not yet born. If not the stunning grace of unicorns, these miracles as rare at GLA, a small boy walks on water. Who's to say this miracle is lessened by the horns of that cool water buffalo beneath? Insistent presence, leave him room to pray, yet smartly field a thunderbolt gone stray, and sometimes at my father's grave a wreath. Let him move as I move through Shattercane in this Nebraska heat, or murderous rain in rice fields under fire, alive and wry. Or, if a daughter, may you fortify her vision, that she see both truth in thorns and loveliness more rare than unicorns. So Laura, that's the poem I wrote for you when you were not yet born. I have a few others that I want to read, and not very many. At Stanford, and later at Iowa City, where I wrote in the late 50s and early 60s, there was a prevalent philosophy known as logical empiricism or positivism, and it had to do with the notion that we are pretty well determined in who we are and who we are going to be and what we will do. I've never much liked that philosophy. I keep hearing about how we are the product of historical forces, emotional forces, environmental forces, hereditary forces, and other forces. I do not believe, and I guess that's because I see the daily heroism of people around me. I do not believe in a deterministic universe. I do not believe that we are objects of forces that act upon us. But I had to respond to it. And sometimes the best way to respond is by ridicule. So I wrote this poem, and it's an interesting poem. If anybody ever tells you that there are no rhymed poems in iambic dimeter written this century, you are about to hear one. Iambic dimeter is 4 syllables a line, and it's hard to write. And this was my punch at a whole philosophical movement. The name of my poem addressing that particular philosophy is Ode to a Pinball Machine. We shift and pause, helpless in laws of speed and weight, and this is fate. Bright numbers gloss our constant loss. The number scored is one's reward. I don't believe that about life, but it was my way, at least, of attacking that particular philosophical position. I am interested in Greek mythology and Roman mythology. I'm interested in the way that the Bible and the ancient mythological writers have influenced our literature. And once again, I make demands on my readers. The next two poems, and the last two I'm going to read, before we moved on to other things, have to do with, if I may call it, special learning. They have to do with the notion that we can take the old Greek mythologies and play around with them a little bit and apply them to modern life. See what happens. I speak in both poems of Eros. Eros, sometimes called Cupid, is the ancient mythological god of sexual love. We know a little bit about Eros. We know, for instance, that nobody ever saw Eros's face. The notion that love is blind. And then I went a step further in this first poem. I had just read about, forgive me being pedantic, but I have to do this to explain the poem. The old story about Zeus. Remember old Zeus and the old concept of Zeus rolling across the heavens, loving whatever woman he loved. He saw Leda, he fell in love, and he turned himself into a swan. He saw Europa, and he fell in love, and he turned himself into a bull. But Zeus's greatest accomplishment was with a woman named Danae. Danae's father had been to the oracle, and the oracle had said, "You will have a daughter, and your daughter will give birth to a son, and your son will kill you." So he said, "I know what I'll do." See, this is the old Greek notion that you can defeat the fates, and of course you can't. He said, "I will put her in a tower, and I'll have just a little hole in the top for a little light and air, and give her some food, and nobody will ever see her, and she can't have a son, and he can't kill me." Well, old Zeus wasn't to be fooled, of course. Rolling across the heavens, he spied her, and she was beautiful. Now, how was he going to do this one? He couldn't turn himself into a swan or a bull, so he turned himself into a thundercloud, and he rolled across the heavens, and it came down in a kind of a golden rain, and that golden rain came through the tower and impregnated her, and she gave birth to the son, who quite by accident killed him. And now, when I was a boy, did a lot of field work, and I was out picking plums one day. Believe it or not, I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about other things that boys think about. And I wrote this poem called Eros in the Orchard. The plums, red spheres against the naked sky, shake in the broken heat like rising fire. The orchard shudders as the wind comes high. I come not quickly down in golden rain, when the plum tree is black against the sky, but leap forth, brute, from deep within the brain, and fade not as seducer nor as sin, but mindless sense, and as with golden rain, the air is sweeter where a god has been. That's one of my two poems about love. It had to do with a what of love, and most of them do. There are a few poems about love that have to do with the how, and I thought about that a little bit. People never write about the hard work of love. Love is damn hard work. Staying in love, preserving the love. I can't think of any harder work or any more rewarding work. And again, I am captured by the Greek mythological concept of Eros. We cannot see his face. And what does this mean? So I wrote a very small poem on that subject, and I'll read that now. This is called Love and the Plain Style. Praise lusty innocence, then studiously undo false mystery with sense, for sense is true. Cultivate fair deceit, bastard of lust and chance, love dies or ripens sweet in circumstance. Speak of love's empty face, but praise the cautious heart. For much of love is grace, and much is art. I'm going to move on into my book of prose, but first I want to introduce my co-reader tonight. Glenna is a distinguished poet. She has a number of books out. She's the only person I know who's been invited to the Nobel Award dinners, been nominated for a Pulitzer. I will say this, might be the only chance I ever get to say it in public, that as an undergraduate at Stanford, I got to meet Robert Frost, Marion Moore, Aldous Huxley. As a student at the University of Paris, I played ping pong with Norman Mailer and James Jones. I think I've only known one really great writer, and that is my sister. And she is going to give us a few poems, and then I'm going to move into some of my prose, and then she's going to give us a few more poems, and then I'm going to get to the really good part. So, Glenna, would you come up here and read, please?
Thank you, Steve. I'm delighted to be with you here tonight. 30 years ago, I graduated from the University of Nebraska. As Steve said, I'm in California now. I'm poet in residence at the largest prison in the world, California Men's Colony, and I've lived in many places since I left here. South America, Albuquerque, New Mexico, but I always try to come back to Nebraska. Every Memorial Day, we try to go out to lay peonies on the graves of our parents and grandparents. And I always feel that I'm communing with the people here who joined me in life. My first writing teacher was Wilbur Gaffney. You see his name right above me here. Thanks for the blessing, Bill. And I remember saying to him many years ago, I think I owe it to you for what I've become. And he said, well, you aren't anybody yet. So maybe now, since I get to read here at the library, I am somebody. And mine don't make me look distinguished, but I really need them. I'd like to start the reading with poems to my children. This book is Unexpected Grace. It's from Turkey Press in Santa Barbara, California. The first is to my son, Eric. I knew you were a boy when you were still a miniature ship inside the bottle. I had been sunning in the orchard, waiting to turn the color of old glass half buried in sandhills. Suddenly the splinter everywhere. Like all mothers of sailors, I will have to let you go alone on your next voyage. This is the one to my daughter, Linda, passing through sleep. Your voices splash the mountain of my death. Lover, daughter, your questions arch like fish. Egyptian priests balance voices. Yours are equal in sweetness and timbre. You will travel together. I, the canyon, sounding echo. Lover, daughter, leave your dialogue, volcano and ash. I cross over the bridge of a phrase, in no hurry, going to visit Istasiwatl, loved for eons. Wheat straw. The tractors plowed me under the deep gray loam with shreds of pottery and arrowheads. Gone, my yellow hair that sang to the trawlers. Foolish one, over piles of bituminous coal, the bee gathers honey from vetch and yarrow. Foolish one, to think that winter could ever come. Orchard. Morning sun pulls up the guy wires. The early spider tosses lines from avocado to berry vine. I plow up from underground in time for the seeding. How could I eat the pomegranate seeds? Why did I spend my life sleeping? Okay, Steve, what mythological character is that down in the underground?
I know all about it, but I'm not going to say.
I don't blame you. Persephone? Yoga. Yoga can wait. I take the untried road, a country path to Shandon, and while my friends bend and stretch, I wander through wildflowers. For a solid winter, I fixed myself in postures, keeping promises, getting there on time, and bending under yokes. Now a solid hour, I bend and stretch the road, meditate on lupin, grow late and later. I'll conclude it now. One was about Memorial Day in Maui. I always like to come back to Nebraska, but that time I found myself in Hawaii. Memorial Day, Maui. The island drives to work early. At 7:30, Mazdas wheel into construction zones. Tractors plow red hills for pineapple and sugar cane. Over the racket of jackhammers, I smell the refinery. Or is it sweet plumeria, the graveyard flower, fingering my balcony? Do spirits still linger? Do they stop on vacation? Bulldozers roll a course over Hawaiian graves. Below me, live bodies surf. Where can the dead be safe? Will you remember peonies for the tombstones of my grandparents, my parents, and me in the buffalo grass of a Nebraska cemetery? And the last poem, Visiting Hours. My aunt tells me she's writing a story just by turning the leaves of the pad. Beautiful, not a word on the page. It's light, pure light. Against her hospital screen, I sense Nebraska wheat. Touch the wooden wagon Grandpa pulled me in, nights too hot to sleep. Feel ants crawl from the peonies. Our lives grow bound through every year by every wind. I am reading your story. My heart turns page after page. I don't think many people in California know what it's like to have a night too hot to sleep, but we do. And I'd like to turn the reading over to my brother, but first of all, I want to introduce another member of our family. This is my brother, Tom Berry, our brother, Tom Berry.
Hi.
Would you like to read one of your poems?
I had a couple dirty jokes I'd like to
Okay. Thank you, Steve.
Well, if Tom won't tell any dirty jokes, I will only comment that Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, and everybody knows that. I'm going to read a little bit from my prose book. This was an interesting book. It came out, and a book club was nice enough to pick it up, and the Washington Post was nice enough to write reviews about it, but it was not a smashing commercial success. It came out at a time at which books about Vietnam were supposed to carry a great deal of shame and self-flagellation, and frankly, there was nothing about my service in Vietnam I'm a bit ashamed of. So, I will read parts of it, then Lena will read, and then we'll get to the good part. This is all just the salad, the vegetables. Wait till we get to the dessert. The book is autobiographical, and I've read parts of it before. I have segments that I like to read, and then I kind of skip over, and I'm going to make this, I don't know how short I'm going to make it because I want to leave room for Glenn and room for me to conclude, but everybody who's read this book or has reviewed it has said they saw a little different perspective of Vietnam than they had seen before. I am not, I think, anything as innocent as an optimist or anything as simple as an idealist, but it seems to me that we ought to have reached the point at which, in terms of the overall American experience, we can view Vietnam with something other than spasms. And so I tried to write about my experiences, and I hope you'll enjoy the small parts I'm reading. I tried lawsuits north near the DMZ, and south in the Delta. I tried lawsuits in the Angel Wing of the Cambodian border and on the South China Sea. My courts-martial were wherever I was assigned, and I interviewed witnesses and wrote wills in all 4 core areas of operations. I got shot at, and I fired back. But my perspective was that of a lawyer. I'm going to pause here and tell you a little history. I was commissioned an infantry officer. I am a graduate of the Infantry Officer School at Fort Benning, Georgia. And for that reason, I was able to lead patrols and participate in whatever was going on, and I was still able to try lawsuits. So I ended up being the only lawyer a lot of GIs ever saw. I went from place to place and point to point, and as I said, wrote some wills. I mention that here because I'm not going to read the whole book, but I tell you that by way of background for what I'm talking about. Any good lawyer lays his foundation. He knows how to offer evidence for limited purposes, and he is anxious to define the modesty of his enterprise. To say that the law is the limitation of my Vietnam vision is at once too narrow and too broad. I was also a soldier and a citizen. And there is no way one book could do justice to the subject, the law in Vietnam. Reviewing testimony of cases I tried with numerous units, 101st Airborne, 1st Infantry, 1st Cav, 5th Special Forces, and others, I find that my old cases draw what is, for me at least, a kind of experiential map of Vietnam. I'm skipping now. The witness was sobbing almost uncontrollably. My interpreter and I had been taking her statement in preparation for trial. There was no doubt in my mind that my 2 clients had gang raped her. And there was no doubt in my mind that her testimony, along with other evidence, would convict them. So I already had a plea bargain struck. Still, it was my job to do the best I could for my men during the hearing on sentencing. Almost as an afterthought, I asked my interpreter, see if there is anything I can do for her. They talked together, quietly, intensely. Sir, she says she wants a certificate of honorability. She says her husband won't sleep with her again until she has a document showing it wasn't her fault. I had never heard of any such instrument, but I had with me a clerk typist and an interpreter, and I composed a document in English, French, and Vietnamese, and I dated it, and I signed it with a flourish and managed to attach some kind of ribbon and seal to it. She took the document, visibly grateful. I never saw her again. I had done what I could. Many of my acquaintances say to me, "You must be a very bad person because you represent people in serious trouble." But you see, if I had left that case to a hack or a butcher or an amateur, that woman wouldn't have that certificate. If I had been a good boy and stayed home, she wouldn't have had that certificate. The Vietnamese lady had come within the sphere of the law, or rather within in its gravity, the pull of the law's power. The problems were solved in ways having little to do with law as an abstract concept, but having much to do with people, their injuries, wounds, fears, and loss of hope. I have heard complaints that a law degree is a license to steal. Of course, any professional license gives the healer commercial advantage over his victim. But there is also the opportunity to dispense a little compassion, a little common sense, to help some poor bastard through the jungles and firefights of daily living. The law itself may be the solution, or it may be part of the problem. In the late 15th century, the Renaissance was spreading in Western Europe. In 1474, in Basel, a rooster came under the charge of having laid an egg. The human mind and spirit soared with magnificent cathedrals and paintings and the beginnings of great literature. The local prosecutor took the position that any rooster who laid an egg must be affiliated with the devil. The rooster was put to trial. It is difficult not to sympathize with the earnest defense counsel attempting, as he did, to persuade the court that the evidence against the rooster was not conclusive. It was largely circumstantial. The rooster had not harmed anybody. From available historical reports, it is impossible not to imagine the scrawny rooster sitting there in the courtroom, the defense lawyer pleading into the bored faces of the judges. With appropriate ceremony, the rooster was convicted and put to death. At about the time Shakespeare was born, ambitious prosecutors were bringing cases against animals and against dead people and against inanimate objects. To state merely that the law has been a little slow, that the law tends to lag behind the best thinkers of its time, would be an oversimplification. The law has always proceeded according to its own inscrutable pace, and no amount of scholarship or reform has ever made it any better than the people who administered it. And those of us who lawyered in Vietnam entered the country in ignorance. We did not know where we were. And we represented GIs, none of whom knew where they were. So we tried to work the approximate magic of the law in utter blindness during a firestorm. I'm going to skip a few paragraphs here. There are many cases that simply blur in my memory. There were acquittals for which no records were made, and it is impossible for me to reconstruct those cases. I remember some of my clients better than others. But to me, in retrospect, they all seem to be men who somehow survived the crisis of war and prosecution. Among them were those whose very humanity appeared to have been destroyed. Amid the ruins, I sought gallantry where I could find it, and I pled for mercy where I could not. The actions of a man at war must be judged in terms of who that man was before he went to war. An isolated act of heroism or betrayal takes its meaning from the soldier's prior life history and the way in which that soldier with that past responds to a certain set of circumstances. Let there be no mistake. There is real heroism and there's real cowardice. I have never suggested to a jury a purely mechanistic or deterministic theory of human behavior. But I did suggest at court-martial after court-martial that the jury could not make its final judgment of the man and his actions until the jury had considered the man and his past. As to special circumstances, the members of the court were all serving in Vietnam at the time of the trials. They did not need to be informed or reminded that no word, thought or deed or in battle or under conditions of war has a precise peacetime parallel. We were all living on Mars, deceptively similar to Earth, and yet. I am going to skip to the very last chapter of the book. The last chapter is very short, and I'll read only a part of it. I'll read the opening paragraph, and I'll skip over paragraph to paragraph. I think you will pick up that by the end, and there are a lot of lawsuits in between and trials, and if you like that kind of thing, it's, forgive my saying this, is worth checking the book out. Go downstairs and check it out, but I'm not going to talk about it tonight. I think of all my pleadings and my judgments, of myself and the men I represented. I think of our journey and of our return, and I try to bring some form and shape to my own ideas of where we had been and what we had done. We came home much as Gulliver came home, benumbed and awry. He had tried to understand where he had been and what he had done, and had tried to know what had happened to him. Coming home, he found himself seeking understanding from others. Perhaps it was that final denial, his failure to be understood at all, that led to his madness and his rage. Skipping down, some of our memories are darkly lyrical. The ancient Aztecs had made their idols perfect by mixing human blood into the materials. That was the only way to put together a good lawsuit in Vietnam. A setting forth of one's selfhood in ways we would never again have the opportunity to do. Just a few more paragraphs. I would walk the rear perimeters when I drew officer of the day and be challenged by the GI with a loaded rifle. Beyond the rear perimeter, darkness, and I would go back to the bunker and log in my tour. Sometimes I would think of my great-grandfather, John Stevens, who left his home in Virginia and fought for the Iowa Infantry during the American Civil War. I would sleep in the dark, heavy room with the overhead fan moving slowly and dream of the Montagnards with their animistic practices, the Banar who filed their teeth and wore loincloths, of the Rade with their sorcerers and their sacrifices of fowl. Courtrooms in homes and courtrooms in buildings that could have been homes or whorehouses, courtrooms in tents, courtrooms under thatch roofs, dreaming, patching things together, getting ready for the trip home. Dreaming of that weary land. It was a weary land. The sacred Mekong had come 2,500 miles from its source in Tibet. And here we flew over scorched cathedral palms, and from a helicopter you could see the craters where the mortar shells and rockets had made the nights to shudder year after year. A land weary with whispers and rumors blending into the sense of a jaded weariness. The old coffin maker in his hammock outside a small village composed of nothing but straw, and water buffalo and hooches and men and women and children. I had begun this chapter referring to Gulliver, my favorite character in fiction, when he returned from his travels, and I conclude with that. Gulliver's madness and his rage were cousins to despair. Salvation lies amid the commonplace, the measured action, doing what we can. Glenna is now going to read a couple more, and then we'll get to the good part. Glenna, would you take over?
Thank you, Steve. I, too, have been trying to write some poems about the commonplace. I have a book of hand-set poetry with some prints in it called Silk and Barbed Wire. I hope if you have time afterwards, you'll come up and look at some of these prints. We did it at Cal Poly, the university where I live, and it turns out, and we bound it by hand, and it turns out to be something I'm proud of. The town in California where I live is called Atascadero, and in Spanish what it really means is a mud spring, but we try to glorify it and call it a watering place. And in this poem I call it a darkling mire. Try to use it as a metaphor for bringing together my life with the commonplace. It's called Arrangement. It's 110 in Atascadero this July with poison oleander in full fire. I try to change the arrangement of this bouquet. It's perfect, but I don't know what it means. The thistle is as lovely to remember as the Chinese bellflower. When I bring together silk and barbed wire, ferns curl about my fingers. I haven't a green thumb, I get by. In Colombia, we gave away orchids every day. A boy sold us cheese. It was round and moist as the Colombian sun and wrapped in a banana leaf. He asked me for flowers in a jar. I have to bury my brother, drowned in the arroyo. Atascadero in Spanish means darkling mire. I like it here. I pass the snapdragons. I stop to give them water. I would like to read you a poem about the movie star Gene Seberg. Gene Seberg came from Iowa, as I did. I loved acting, gained the lead in our Miss Brooks as Sister Margaret in The Hasty Heart. Jean was lucky. Otto Preminger cast her in The Lark. She played Bonjour Tristesse, married her French lawyer in Trinity Lutheran Church. Her husband introduced her to Romain Gary, the novelist, now consul general in Los Angeles. She loved Gary and bore his son. Gary said, "You have to understand the Midwest." She emerged from it intelligent, talented, beautiful, with the naivete of a child. To me, her goodwill is infuriating idealism. It made her defenseless. In the end, it came between us. I understand the Midwest and love with too much innocence. Jean married Gary. While filming Paint Your Wagon, fell in love with Clint Eastwood, later with Hakeem Jamal, assassinated for betraying black Muslims. Jean wrote to Liberacion. Hakeem Jamal, cousin of Malcolm X, ex-user, convict, the most beautiful man who walked the earth. He's dead, my Jamal. 8 slugs in the belly, seated in a rocking chair, surrounded my family. You killed my Jamal. Now pregnant, the FBI, the LA Times, and Newsweek speculated about the father, rumored black activist from California. Publicity threw her into labor. A girl was born by cesarean and named Nina after Romaine Gary's mother. The baby died 3 days later. In Marshalltown, they left the coffin open. People could see that Nina was white. Gary insisted, I am the father. At the Left Bank restaurant, La Medina, Jean met Algerian Ahmed Hasni. She started her film, The Legion Parachutes into Kolwezi. After a fight with Hasni, she threw herself upon the metro tracks, was pulled for safety. I prayed for Jean and for those who pulled me from the tracks. She wrote her son, be good and forgive the mama who loves you. Police found her body in a blanket in the back of her Renault on the Rue de Longchamp. Jean was buried at Montparnasse. 3 months later, Romain Gary sat at his desk and put a bullet through his head. He wrote, no connection with Jean Seberg. Lovers of broken hearts are kindly advised to look elsewhere. I would like to conclude my reading now with a poem about being a poet called I Thought They Would Never End. I thought they would never end, the walks through the meadow of blue vervain where heron nested in eucalyptus. I thought they would always remain, my 4 blue eggs. I thought my luck would never end. I would hoist up one skein of flounder after another. Loaves would fall into my open hands. Look, oh look. I think my life will never end. How lazily I go about it. Every day will open to morning glories. Can my world stay the same? No boundary wars, no bombing. I put my teapot on and lose my head again in steam. Thank you for letting me be with you tonight. Steve?
Thank you, Glenna. I promised you a good part. I love to hear Glenna read. She has a wonderful feeling for language, and as I said, I think she's a great writer. I'm going to talk about one of my vices, and my most expensive one, I suppose, my addiction to the literature of Sherlock Holmes. I have tried several times to kick it, but I read Sherlock Holmes all the time, and I'm going to be honest about it, and I'm just going to stand right up here and say, my name's Steve, and I'm a Sherlock Holmes addict. I hope that's okay. A number of years ago in the 1930s, a bunch of guys used to hang around the Algonquin Hotel in New York. One of them was a pretty good prize fighter, a fellow named Gene Tunney. Knocked out Jack Dempsey. Another fellow was Alexander Woollcott. There was some really horrible literature that you had to read when you were a kid. Another one was William Gillette, who was a great actor. Vincent Sterrett was a pretty good writer. And one of the Marlowe brothers, I think it was Christopher Marlowe, as a matter of fact. And they didn't have much better to do, so they talked about Sherlock Holmes. Kind of interested them a little bit. They remembered when Sherlock Holmes, in one of the stories, I think it was A Study in Scarlet, said, I don't have a police force, I have my Baker Street Irregulars. That is to say, the street urchins. He'd give them a shilling and they'd go out and get information for him. Now, somehow along the line, this group of people came to be known as the Baker Street Irregulars. And they would meet at the Algonquin Hotel in New York and talk about the writings of, I don't dare say this, but I will say it, Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, you see, that's wrong because Arthur Conan Doyle was a plagiarist. Actually, it was John Watson, M.D., that wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories, and Arthur Conan Doyle was either a literary agent or an unscrupulous plagiarist. In short, we are all psychopathic liars. All Sherlock Holmes scholars are liars. We tell you that he lived, and he lives. And you say, well, he's got to be 140 something, and we say, fine, that's fairly young for an immortal. We will lie about anything. We love it. It has been my pleasure somehow, I don't know how I got in, but Roger Welsh told me that he wouldn't let me compete in the Liars Hall of Fame in Dannebrog because it's open only to amateurs. So I can only say that somehow along the line, I did get into the Baker Street Irregulars. I have a, you're going to love this one, titular investiture. That is to say, I have a little coin and I have a title, and after I die, someone else gets it if they write enough papers and give enough speeches. So I monkey around with Sherlock Holmes. Margaret and I flew to London once to meet with the London Sherlock Holmes Society. A few years ago, I was trying a court-martial in Japan, and Margaret and I met with the Japanese Sherlock Holmes Society. I meet with the groups all over the country. There's a group in New Mexico that meets in Moriarty, New Mexico, called the Brothers Three Moriarty, and they have the annual Colonel Sebastian Moran trap shoot. I was going to challenge them. I thought they said crap shoot. My ears aren't as good as they used to be. But anyway, I meet with my fellow psychopaths, my fellow liars, my fellow Sherlockians, and we tell you he is alive. He lives. We know that he lives. And we write these really awful papers, and they're full of lies. And the worst thing about them is that they are based on solid scholarship. You see, we are such good liars that we go through real literature and real history and put a lot of really true things together to concoct a bunch of lies. And we're good at it. I have one paper that is so full of so many lies, so full of so many true things, so many historical things, leading up to a preposterous lie, that this has been published in England and America and Japan. This is one of the greatest examples of mendacity any of you are ever going to hear, because I got a lot of true statements tacked together in a really outrageous lie. And I thought I'd conclude tonight with that, since we've devoted enough time and attention to the truth tonight, and I think it's time to get back on track, so to speak. This is my paper. It is outrageous. Everything in it is true, except, of course, the conclusions, which are lies. Anyway, it's short. And one other thing I have to tell you, when we're done, you're all invited to my house. Margaret has a nice cake and some coffee, and you're all invited to come over. And I promise not to push anybody into the pool or tell any lies. And we live at 3801 Stockwell. Some of you have been there, and those of you who haven't, I'll be glad to give you instructions. While Glenn is showing you her book, I'll give you instructions. But I hope you'll enjoy this, because you will never again hear so many true statements, actual facts, pieces of literature, taped together to make such a totally outrageous, disgusting lie. I'm kind of proud of it. I can do this without flinching. This paper is called The Holmes Boys, A Transatlantic Perspective. Enjoy the actual historical facts. No, I'm lying. Oh yeah, and my first line is stolen from T.S. Eliot too, because if you're a liar you can steal too, that's okay. History has its cunning corridors. Time has befogged our minds. Canonical toasts have blurred the memory, and we have forgotten. The fact is that Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., the famous poet, philosopher, physician, and professor of medicine, was the older brother to Mycroft and Sherlock Holmes. Well, some of you ought to be squirming by now. Because this obvious fact has been so long ignored and neglected, I will state some of the more obvious clues. This is the awful part, because I start saying true things now, you see. The recorded adventures in the canon occurred between 1874 and 1914. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. was born on August 29, 1809, and his funeral was in 1894. According to the history books, he died at the relatively young age of 85. Given his stamina, his philosophy, this is, of course, incredible. Observe Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr.'s slim volume, 100 Days in Europe, where he first mentions his initial idea for the trip as follows. This is a quote, and you can check it out. When my friends asked me why I did not go to Europe, I reminded them of the fate of Thomas Parr. He was only twice my age and was getting on famously toward his 200th year when the Earl of Arundel carried him up to London, and being feasted and made a lion of, he found there a premature and early grave at the age of only 152 years. He lies in Westminster Abbey, it is true, but he would probably have preferred the upper side of his own hearthstone to the underside of the slab which covers him. Those who think those lines were written in jest can only be said to be ignorant of the hardihood of the old Yankee. Later, in the same volume, he said, "It was no sooner announced in the papers that I was going to England than I began to hear of preparations to welcome me. An invitation to a club meeting was cabled across the Atlantic. One of my countrymen, who has a house in London, made an engagement for me to meet friends at her residence. I have done extensive research, and there is no evidence anywhere that the club mentioned was not the Diogenes Club, nor is there any evidence whatsoever that the residence in London was not Mrs. Hudson's at 221B Baker Street." Where does this leave us? We know that Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. was born in London in 1886. Was in London in 1886. And what was the famed physician doing there? According to Baring Gould, the only case that was solved at the precise time that Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. was in London was the resident patient. You will recall that a certain physician arrived on Wednesday, October 6, 1886 at 221B Baker Street. Upon meeting the doctor, John H. Watson is alleged to have said, "Are you not the author of a monograph upon obscure nervous lesions?" What American does not know? The Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. was on the faculty of the Harvard Medical School. As the case progresses, we have some indications of catalepsy and many medical discussions of symptoms. In that particular case, a medical specialist was deceived by certain fake symptoms, but Sherlock Holmes made a proper diagnosis as follows. Dr. Watson said catalepsy, and Holmes answered, "A fraudulent imitation, Watson, though I hardly dare to hint as much to our specialist. It is very easy complaint to imitate." The mystery begins to unravel as a result of a medical diagnosis and analysis of symptoms. It was a specialized medical diagnosis that had escaped the well-known specialist from London, as well as John H. Watson, M.D. The diagnosis made by the detective in this case was made, catch this, by one of superior medical training. I hope you're all with me. It is obvious that Sherlock Holmes wanted the eldest of the three brothers to have an opportunity to solve the mystery. And Oliver, call him Ollie, Oliver wanted to prove his ability to do so. And the ever discreet Watson allowed Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. to solve this particular mystery under the guise of his being Sherlock Holmes. It should be no surprise to us that the same sensitive Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. who wrote The Last Leaf and Old Ironsides should have had the same deep feelings of justice as did his violin-playing brother. And as for the powers of observation of Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., when he was a professor at Harvard, his favorite trick with new medical students was to show them a jar of urine and ask each young student to please urinate into a jar. He would say, "Now I am going to tell you that you can understand some of the properties of urine by taste. You must do precisely as I do." He would insert his index finger into his jar of urine, then insert his middle finger into his mouth, asking the students to do likewise. And after the young men had all tasted their own urine, he would explain that had they been observing him, and had they done as he did, they would not have put the same finger into their mouths that they had put into the urine. It was his object lesson in observation, and I have no doubt that he may at one time or another, I hate to say this, he may at one time or another have played the same trick on young Sherlock in teaching him the powers of observation. You know, we wish things like this hadn't happened, but we handle history as it comes to us, folks. But the strange coincidence between the dates of Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. and Sherlock Holmes does not end here. Most of us have been dissatisfied with the explanations of how it was that the incidents at the Reichenbach Falls occurred in 1891, and yet a substantial number of the recorded adventures of Sherlock Holmes occurred between 1894 and 1911. Now, folks, we all know that in 1891, Holmes died at Reichenbach. We all know that in 1894, he started solving cases again. I mean, that's got to worry you a little bit. You go home at night, you think about that, right? It's been bothering you all for a long time. You're lucky. You're here, and I'm going to tell you what happened. From English history, it is clear that between the death of Sherlock Holmes in 1894, there was no great detective to carry on the Holmes name in London, and the need was becoming urgent. And then, mysteriously, in 1894, Sherlock Holmes reappeared on the scene. And what happened that same year, 1894? I know you all know the answer to this, but in 1894, mysteriously, there was held the funeral of Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. Close research has yielded me no evidence whatsoever that the coffin was open, or that anybody saw a body in the coffin. All we know for certain is in 1894 there was a formal public funeral for Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. And shortly thereafter, who reappeared on the London scene that same year? Our master. Our Redeemer liveth, Sherlock Holmes. 31 adventures were recorded after Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. returned to assume the mantle of his brother Sherlock. In those 31 adventures, I have counted 72 examples of medical or scientific knowledge used by Holmes in solving mysteries. I have counted 14 examples of Holmes speaking with poetic diction, which was nowhere apparent in the earlier adventures. I have counted 19 examples of Yankee ingenuity that came to the fore in solving crimes, a characteristic that was not present in the earlier adventures. However, let us consider the career of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., that great legal scholar whose interest in the law was without doubt inspired by Uncle Sherlock. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. was born in 1841. His funeral with a closed casket. Nobody saw a body in that casket. Was in 1935. A young age indeed, in a family in which the male is expected to live 200 years. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. made this statement: "If a man has the soul of Sancho Panza, the world to him will be Sancho Panza's world. But if he has the soul of an idealist, he will make his world ideal. Of course, the law is not the place for the artist or the poet. The law is the calling of thinkers. But to those who believe with me that not the least godlike of man's activities is reason, that to know is not less than to feel, I say, and I say with no doubt, that a man may live greatly in the law as well as elsewhere, that there as well as elsewhere his thought may find its unity with an infinite perspective, that there as well as elsewhere he may wreak himself upon life, he may drink the bitter cup of heroism, may wear his heart out after the unattainable. Here we see Sherlock's nephew, so much more like Sherlock than was his older brother, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. For Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. was the pure rationalist, as was the Sherlock Holmes of the first 47 adventures of the sacred writings, before his identity had been assumed by his older brother. This was the birthright and the tradition that Sherlock Holmes passed on to his nephew. And then, after the mysterious burial, so-called, of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. in 1935, it seems safe to assume that that was the date at which Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. actually died at the very young age of 126 years. For Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. went to London, and the mantle passed to him. In his own way, he continues to defeat the forces of evil in London, and it is for this reason that as Americans going to England in the name of Sherlock Holmes, we do not go as beggars or poor cousins, for the bulk of the work of Sherlock Holmes was done by those great Americans, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. and Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. I would not say anything more tonight that you would believe, and I wouldn't blame you a bit, so that concludes the reading, and we will tell you how to get out to our house. Please do come out. Thanks for joining me, Glenn. Good night.